So, it was good TV, but was it good Doctor Who? Welcome back to my review of Series 11 Doctor Who, and today we're talking about Episode 3, Rosa. This was, there's no doubt, an exciting, interesting and arguably important episode of television. I'm less convinced it was a good episode of Doctor Who. I think the themes that they talked about, the way they addressed them, were really very interesting. The scene between Yaz and Ryan, when they're hiding behind the bins from the racist cop, talking about racism now, even with Rosa Parks doing the thing that Rosa Parks does, was a very strong and important element to this story. The fact that one act does not eradicate racism, but at least moves us in a direction, and that can only be a positive thing. I think the Doctor was a bit sidelined this episode, which seems strange to me. It is an episode of Doctor Who, but she was probably the least important of the regular TARDIS crew this time around for me. We saw finally some background for Yaz. We got a bit of personality from her. I liked what I saw there, and Ryan continues to impress. This week's Graham action was perhaps somewhat reduced, but nevertheless, he's still, every time he's on screen, he's a joy for me. I have to say, Bradley Walsh, I've said this 2 episodes in a row now, continues to impress, and I did not expect that. As for Rosa Parks herself, extremely well played. I'm no judge of accent, so don't ask me if it was a good Missouri, Alabama accent, but for me as a Brit, that seemed to work out just fine. The plot for this one was really quite interesting. It resulted in the TARDIS crew, I think, being a little too passive. It's one of the reasons I'm not convinced it's a good episode of Doctor Who. I come to Doctor Who for a certain type of action, and while this was cleverly played, a lot of what we saw was quite passive, and there were lots of montages about them learning stuff about Rosa Parks. The strangest thing about this episode is that the Doctor is not an agent of change in this episode. Normally when we see the Doctor come onto the scene, she is fighting to put something right, some wrong that has happened, which must be fixed. In this case, we're having quite a different fight, a fight to preserve the status quo. And that is quite a different prospect, put a whole different atmosphere to the proceedings. Quite an interesting twist with the sort of punch and counter punch of Krasko and the TARDIS team trying to stop the derailment of the Rosa Parks famous resistance moment, but there was never really a sense of threat from the episode. My favourite moment, without a shadow of a doubt, is when Ryan follows Rosa to her meeting and is just overwhelmed to be in a room with Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King. The villain, assuming we don't play the villain as racism itself, which is, probably arguably who the villain really was in this episode, but is a bit too nebulous to focus on. The villain Krasko, on the other hand, again, playing into this idea that there wasn't much of a threat because of the limiter in his brain, which made me think of Blake Seven and Gan, by the way. I am that old. Because of the limiter in his brain, he was not a direct threat to anyone on the TARDIS team at all. His confrontation against the Doctor, quite nicely framed, again, very cinematic episode, as the last two have been. But this time, just no real sense of anyone in danger, any kind of threat at all. So all told, I think the issues they addressed were important. I think the way they addressed them were clever and interesting, but it lacked that quintessential Doctor Who-ness which I look for from an episode. It felt a bit more like Quantum Leap or Timeless, maybe. Both, fine shows for what they are, but very different from what I expect from Doctor Who. On Friday, I'm going to do a follow-up Friday about historical episodes of Doctor Who, since that seems to be the issue of the day. And join me next week, and we will talk about spiders in the UK.